I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Claudia Johnson here at Pro Bono Net. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. Today we're going to be looking at online intake, and we're going to focus on best practices. And we are very happy to have joining us in this conversation folks who have been implementing online intake, different tools and different softwares and processes. By no means, you know, there was an email that circulated that Jeff Hogue had collected a survey of everybody that was planning or doing online intake, and I believe as of the date of the survey, there were 26 different initiatives in the legal aid community. So by no means are the examples that we're showing exhaustive, but I think that in a lot of ways they represent different approaches to a new opportunity to receive applications from clients, from people looking for legal services. And we have also, so Craig Harrison from Utah will showcase some of the things that he tackled as he was creating his online intake project. And William Guyton and Jaffe Pickett would also talk about some of the things, how they set up their online intake system, and some of the things that they found to be crucial in the process. And then we're also having, as a panelist, Dina Nikitaides, who is with A2J in Chicago Kent Law School, and is a guru and leader with the A2J Author software. She has been doing a series, and so she will be giving her perspective as somebody that has worked with many programs looking at online intake in that particular software mode, and some of the things that she comes across, and we'll highlight some other resources that are available in that realm. So without saying much more, we're going to jump into this. We're hoping to only be talking for 55 minutes to leave in for questions at the end. The session could go up to 90 minutes, but time is precious. But if people do have questions and want to keep a discussion going on, some of us can stay for a little bit after we finish with the formal presentations. And we would like to hear questions and have people raise their answers as much as we can to make this interactive. So let me just jump in. So when thinking about online intake, you know, I started talking to different people in the community. And one of the things that really becomes clear is that we need some terminology, because different groups, different funders, different programs define intake in different ways. And so this is just my take on how I would use the words. It doesn't mean that everybody has to agree on this, but for purposes of this conversation, I thought that if we define some terms, it would make it easier to kind of stay on the same page with everyone that is thinking about online intake or online applications overall. So for me, when I think about online intake, I'm thinking about the online application tool, whatever that may be or look like. It could be a PDF fillable, it could be an A2J Author tool, it could be a FormRouter, it could just be an email that people send in to somebody that is going to provide some sort of service, in our situation, legal services. And then, to me, online intake means that behind that application, there's a whole system of intake that mimics and tracks the regular not online intake. And different programs set up their intake systems in different ways. But generally, it requires some investment in resources. To do intake is not something that you just cannot do on the fly. You have to have protocols and procedures and set client expectations. So to me, online intake is the combination of, one, the data collection form or tool, and then whatever system of intake you have modified to take and process the online data that you're getting. So that's what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this webinar. So in terms of an online intake system, it may require having a case management system. It may require having a callback queue. It may require, in some cases, some people are supporting online intake systems with web chat to support the application or the processing of the application. It probably includes staff. It could be staff that's dedicated to online intake or staff that is shared with the other intake systems that the program uses. So, you know, it's more than just the form. When we're thinking about setting up an online intake system, we're thinking about the whole thing and not just the tool. And so then I started thinking, well, you know, then the word triage sometimes is applied to online intake depending on the context. Triage, I think a lot of us think of triage as deciding how it denotes, if we think about medical triage, is deciding which are the emergency cases that need to have something done right now, and which are the ones that we can stabilize and then process at a different pace. And with intake, with online intake, there may be some triage going on or not. So I think triage is more deciding the time needs of the application and then the resources allocated to that application. In the context of legal services, triage generally happens after some determination of eligibility has been done. Is this a client that we can serve, and does it meet our priorities as a program? If the question is yes, then how urgent is it? What resources can we share with this person right now and in the future? So triage sometimes happens after the initial eligibility, but in some cases, like if you're at a self-help center, or if you're doing a fair, or you're set up in some sort of remote type setting, it could be that the first thing you do is triage, and then you do an intake to look at eligibility and services that can be rendered. So triage is part of intake, but it's not necessarily intake for purposes of this conversation. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that a lot of times we talk about triage, we talk about intake, and in this context, I'm kind of saying triage does not include eligibility. Eligibility is something that is done separate from triage, though where it happens before triage or after triage really depends on the particular situation, how the individual is coming to you. And so intake, you know, is just the process that a nonprofit, including a pro bono project, uses to accept, reject applicants based on some sort of clearly articulated criteria, and it includes data collection, review of the application, acceptance or denial of the application, notification to the applicant of whether it's a yeah, a nay, or an unlimited unbundled service, depending on your jurisdiction, and then a system of referrals for all of the different outcomes of the intake process. So I'm making some assumptions, and I'm assuming that all legal nonprofits do intake for a lot of really good reasons, primarily that everybody that is in the legal nonprofit world faces some real limits on resources. And generally, funders do require that you serve certain particular types of clients for their particular types of funds. The other assumption that I'm making, which we could talk about if people actually disagree, I perceive intake, and I think that most funders perceive intake as an administrative function of a program, and they perceive it to be covered by the overhead of the program. Very few funders out there are looking to fund intake just for the sake of intake. If they're funding intake, it's because they're funding a different way of doing intake, like maybe with a hotline or online intake. And outside of LSC, a lot of funders don't want to fund intake. What they want to fund is legal advice, direct services. So right now that, you know, IOLTA funds have significantly dropped, and other types of funds are also declining, the amount of resources that go into intake become more and more scrutinized for effectiveness. And just wanted to highlight that. I don't know if everybody agrees with me that funders view intake as administrative, and that it's really hard to fund intake activities because they assume that clients kind of come already self-defined, and it's sometimes very hard to identify the 68-year-old living in a particular county that has a cognitive issue that is being evicted. If you have a funder that's giving you money to do that, it's going to be a good 20, 30 minutes before you get to figure out, can I cover this client with these funds or not? So that's kind of what I mean by that. So, and the other assumption I'm making is that online intake is another door to your program, not necessarily the only door, that it is something that can be used to supplement other types of intake, and it's one of the many ways to enter into legal aid or legal delivery services. So in thinking about this, I thought, well, I don't know, if there are any national guidelines or rules on intake, and since a lot of these things depend on the rules of confidentiality, the ethical rules of confidentiality, the ethical rules on communication with prospective clients, etc., and all of those are locally defined, the closest thing that we have to figure out how we as a community should be doing intake is to look at the SCLAID Standards of Practice for legal aids working with low-income groups. And there's two standards, Standard 2 and Standard 4. Standard 4.1 is basically the one that kind of sets out, and these were released, I believe, in 2004, if I'm not correct. Somebody correct me, but
Claudia, this is Al. I just wanted to give you a time check. It's 2:20.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so that basically the provider should have multiple entryways, and this is echoed all through. Standard 2.2, this now it refers mostly to telephony systems, but it also applies to online systems. Where it talks about how technology can be used to overcome limitations reaching remote populations, and it can open a whole new way of providing services in underserved areas. So that's a really good one to review. The other one is 2.3, and I know that some of you on the call have been working on statewide and regional systems. The standards do encourage sharing of this. If it's an administrative activity, it could be an administrative activity that could be shared across multiple programs, and technology is making this easier and easier every day. And for me, the most important part of the standard is, I think, what it says. That this one I take very seriously is how denials of service should be done. And basically, if you read it, it basically says that it has to be done and explained very clearly. The word promptly pops throughout all of the standards, but a denial should be explained clearly. It should be done promptly, and it says that if referrals are made, the referral should be made as quickly as possible, so that the rejected applicants who were rejected promptly can seek assistance with other projects to protect their rights. And I think that this is the key for online system, is that with online intake systems, you can really make this standard come alive very well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think that it's this piece here where online intake, I think, is perfectly suited to do this. There are other reasons to do online intake. It is a gateway, and it goes beyond just picking and choosing clients. It can be a way that you collect data so that you can do analysis and allocate resources. And it allows you to also, once you know where the needs are and the unmet needs are, then you can work with other partners in changing your local delivery system. the LSC Performance Criteria 1, for those of you who are LSC funded, there are some really good questions in there. And I think anyone thinking about starting online intake or even reviewing just your regular intake should go through the LSC Performance Criteria guide and read it and ask themselves these questions. And in this process of asking these questions, you will come up with a better, stronger way or a new way of thinking about intake and online intake and how it works together. And having said this, I will transfer over to Craig, where he did just recently implemented an online system that is LSC funded program. And so some of the things here are particularly related to that funding stream. And I put this slide to kind of highlight the things that Craig's going to cover a little bit more in depth.
Yes, so Claudia asked me to cover specifically some of the things that we did in requirements for our LSC thing, such as the Kennedy eligibility and denials and grievances and that type of thing. So what we're going to do is essentially just show you a couple of screenshots of what we've done. Utah Legal Services is a statewide program, so we didn't have to deal with other programs in eligibility. But we wanted to do an online intake for two main reasons. One was to give another door to people who were eligible who potentially couldn't get through our intake system on the telephone. And the other one was to help us focus on spending our resources on eligible clients. So our goal with the online intake was not only to comply with the LSC regulations, but also to try to weed out or get out those applicants who were not LSC eligible. So on the next screen, you can see one of the big things that we have to do with LSC eligibility is our definition of who's eligible. So household, as all of you know, probably is a term of art, and it's different for each program. We get to define our own household, so to speak. And so what we did here is we've defined household several places through our interview. This is just one of the places where we have. And so what we did is we put the actual definition, which is sometimes difficult to understand for people. So we then put in some specific examples. For those of you who do intake yourself, you know that household is not as easy as black and white. It can be very difficult to figure out who's in the household and who's not in the household. But we've tried to do this to kind of help people understand what we include as part of their household and what we don't. And then the next big issue with LSC eligibility is what their assets are and income is. And we handled the asset and the income valuation much the same, in that we put in a list of what could be assets, and then we of course have another category at the very end. But then we also put in a learn more with what is included in the household. So in this case, we have the do not include any items owned by the person causing your legal problem, because the person has checked that it's a domestic violence case, and so for LSC purposes, you don't have to count the assets in the name of the perpetrator. So again, it's just giving information and trying to help people understand what we include. Once they answer which ones they have, then we go individually through each asset and ask for the amount of each one. Again, because we want to try to help focus on eligible clients and put our resources there, we used the A2J interview because we could do calculations. And essentially what we end up doing is, if the person's assets are over our asset limit for our program, or their income is over 125% of the poverty level, the interview will actually tell them that they don't qualify, that they most likely don't qualify for our services. And then, of course, if they don't qualify, we have to give them an option of a grievance. Rather than give them the whole grievance policy, what we decided to do was just have them call our number. If for some reason the online intake system rejects them, then they can call us and be rescreened by one of our intake workers, and so we give them that information there. And we actually have had people call us and do that. As I mentioned, we do screen for domestic violence. We ask them if their case involves domestic violence. If they say yes to that, and or if they say that they're a non-citizen, the next screen shows our question of whether they're a citizen and a legal resident or none of the above. And then of course the next screen shows if they say that they're none of the above, it asks if their problem is a result of domestic violence or human trafficking, which handles the Kennedy Amendment exception for legal services programs. So if they say they're not a citizen of the United States or a legal permanent resident, but they say that their problem is because of domestic violence or human trafficking, it allows that case to go on rather than reject them. If they said no at this point because they're not a citizen or a permanent resident, the interview would reject them. The other nice thing is we can ask about other criteria as well in the interview. So in this case, if there's domestic violence, we ask who the perpetrator is. And then at the end of the interview, if they've qualified and they can actually submit their information, we offer them two choices. They can call us with priority number, or they can actually chat with us on the website as well. We set up the website to be secure, so it has a security certificate. It's an HTTPS site. So the next slide, again, just talks about domestic violence. We decided a lot of our clients are victims of domestic violence, and so we wanted to make sure that they understood that using a computer could be unsafe. So we put in some safety information that I think I got it off the NNEDV site, which talks about what can be safe, what isn't safe, and give them resources for that as well. We also wanted to make sure that they understood that we weren't going to be contacting them, and that we weren't comfortable giving advice by email. So we specifically, even though we require that they give us an email address, we specifically let them know that we can't give them advice by email, that they still have to talk to us. We also get their preference in language. We have a translator line, as probably most of us all do, so that if their language isn't English that they prefer to talk to us in, we can get that information as well and talk to them in the language that they want us to. And then again, as I mentioned before, they can chat with us online. This picture of chat online, chat offline, it actually turns to color and says we're online when we're online. It is, again, only 9 to 2. What we do is we do intake between the hours of 9 to 2 every day. They can also call us by phone, which gives them priority status in the queue. So if they have done the online application and then they call us on that number, they get bumped to the front of the queue, so they, in theory, don't have to wait as long. And in fact, when comparing the data, the people that had done the online application had to hold an average of 1 minute versus the average of, I think, 5 minutes from our regular intake. So, and what we've seen, we've only been live since June, so it's just starting to begin. We have had increased calls each month. We started out at 20, and in August we had 60, so it is continuing to go up every month. But we did some comparisons of our queue times between online intake when they called us after completing the application versus just calling us cold. And in our queue times, the average time was 10 minutes for an online application versus 12 minutes on our regular queue. But anecdotally, we think that may be a little high. Some cases has actually taken half as much time. Intake worker has been able to do a full intake, getting it to an advocate in the same amount of time that we normally would just do the eligibility screening. Also, we compared the number of eligible clients, LSC eligible clients, that came through the online intake system versus our regular system. And as you can see, we had, of our online intake applications, 87% of them were LSC eligible versus at 55% of the ones that came through our phone system. And then, of course, another impact we've seen is that we have had greater availability to people. We have 55% urban versus 45% rural of our online intake versus the 63-37%. We've had clients who are hard of hearing, where before we would have to bring them into the office and meet with them in person, which we have a centralized intake system, so all of it goes through the phone except for the hard of hearing, and this has helped with our hard of hearing clients. We can actually talk to them without them having to come into the office, especially those who don't know sign language and can use a relay person. Also, we've had victims of domestic violence use the system and say that they preferred the system over the telephone because they had small children and didn't want to talk about the abuse in front of their children who they had to take care of. And so they were able to do that with our chat option. And we actually even had someone who was temporarily out of the country with his parents from Sweden who was able to contact us, who normally wouldn't have been able to contact us. So we've seen clients who normally probably couldn't have gotten through to us get through to us that way. And that is a summary of some of the screens of our online intake. So
thank you, Greg. We have some questions, but I'm gonna leave them to the end. You already answered some, answering when you got started, and there were some other policy questions, but I will, if it's okay with everybody, I'll leave those to the end. So William, we're gonna now move on to you and talk about your online intake application.
Okay. Our online intake application, it's been up and running 2 years now. We spun it up in October of 2009 as part of the National Pro Bono Net celebration. And basically, to tell a quick story, the call center director came to me and said, basically, how can we continue to take intakes when the call center is not open to service clients that call in on the 800 number? And essentially, we sat down and very quickly with a cross-functional team, which included 2 technical resources, myself and Janice Franks, and 3 attorneys, the call center director, the training director, and the director of advocacy, sat down and looked for a relatively inexpensive, relatively simple solution to be able to throw online intake up on the web. And we knew a couple of things up front, having spent a lot of time at TIG and listened to other programs do online intake and struggle with integrating their online intake data or how to pull their online intake data off of the online intake system into the case management system. So we knew going in that we needed a solution that would be able, that had the ability to write the online intake data to a database, because we knew the next step was to take that data that we had captured via online intake and pull that data off of the online intake database and into our case management system after it had been approved and reviewed. So we knew we needed that capability, and we took a couple of weeks, searched the web, asked around, and found a company called FormRouter, which allowed us to take a PDF form that mimics our online, that mimics our intake form, and throw that PDF up on the web. And what FormRouter does is they'll go to the terms and conditions page, they'll accept the terms and conditions. Well, once they accept the terms and conditions page, we actually start the intake process. And we attempted to be as simple and concise as possible. We wanted to be able to capture as much information as we could that would be actionable in terms of triage. And everybody can go look at the form. If you go to intake.alsp.org, it'll actually walk you through the entire intake process if you want to actually see the PDF form in its entirety. This is version 1.0, which is the PDF form. We initially ran with just the PDF form for about 6 months, and the demand was so large that we got to the point very quickly after 6 months that we couldn't handle re-entering the data into the case management system. So we contracted with FormRouter to write the piece of middleware that actually takes the online intake data, and once it's approved, takes all of the data out of the online intake database and populates our case management system. So we spent 6 months doing it manually, and finally the call center employees cried uncle and we went ahead and contracted and got the middleware piece done. And now when a client hits the submit button, the online intake team gets an email with the actual PDF, filled out PDF, and at the same time, all of that data that's captured by that form is dropped into the online intake database. So they use the form as a screening tool, and if that looks like a case that they're going to accept in the call center or they're going to farm out to one of our offices, they'll go into the online intake interface, find that particular client, and hit the import key, and it'll actually take all of that data that the form captured and populate our case management system. And that's the PDF form is basically version 1. We're currently in the process, everything that we've learned about the PDF form and some of the good things that are good about it and bad about it, we're designing version 2 of online intake, which takes the PDF form and we're rebuilding the form in HTML for a couple of reasons. One, we've had some feedback where clients have difficulty with the fact that it's a PDF. Maybe their reader isn't up to date or isn't installed properly, or they simply don't have it. We're currently running metrics on all of the online intake data, but we can't see currently where on the PDF form a client may stop filling out the form. Once we convert it to HTML, we're actually going to be able to see where on the form they stopped. And at that point, we can say, well, if they stopped at income, maybe we need to put some more information in the terms and conditions page that talks about you are going to need to provide some income information and make that simpler form. We're also going to be doing a Spanish option, so you'll have an English form and a Spanish form during the transition. And the other thing that we're doing is we're also going to have a mobile version of the HTML form, so you'll be able it'll reformat the form for your smartphone, so we can start doing a more effective job of getting our online intakes via smartphone, because our metrics have shown that a good percentage of all the online intake are being done via smartphones, not just by a PC-based browser or browser.
Anything else, William?
I think that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you.
Still the question? Sure.
Yeah, and if people want to look at the system that William was talking about, we can do that at the end. If people wanna see a demo, if you can raise your hands, and we can do that at the end. It would give us an idea. Okay, so we will switch now and switch to Dina Nikitaides, who is with the Center for Access to Justice and Technology at Chicago-Kent College of Law.
Hi, everybody. So I work with the A2J Author software, which when you saw the screenshots of the Utah intake interview, that was done in A2J Author. So typically, a lot of people start or know A2J Author because they've probably done document assembly projects with it. If you're familiar with Law Help Interactive, and you might have interviews that you host on there. So Claudia, if we go to the first slide, typically A2J Author, a typical project would be for document assembly would be that you would create this online interview that you can see on the left side there. And then after the user enters all their information into the A2J Author interface where it collects the data, the answers that were collected are stored into an ANX file. That file is then partnered with a hot docs form. That means all of the data that was collected during that online interview is put into the form in all the correct places. That form is then displayed back to the end user. They can print it or save it, etc., file it at court. So that's typically how people might know A2J Author, but as you saw with the Utah project, A2J Author is now becoming very common and popular as the front end for online intake. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that A2J Author, as I mentioned, it actually is a data collection interface. So you don't have to have a hot docs component to use A2J Author. You can just collect the data. The process looks a little different. So Claudia, if you click through this slide, there's a little bit of animation here, but you would start with the A2J guided interview, and it would look exactly the same as it would as if you were doing a document assembly project. But when the end user hits submit, their interviews are saved, or their answers are saved in that ANX file. The problem here is that ANX file, whereas before it would go to a hot docs, this time we're trying to get it into your case management system. So you need what I believe William mentioned, that middleware piece, and we call this an XSL transform. What that transform does is take the answers that were in your answer file, that .anx file, and it puts it into a language that is compatible for your case management system. So you end up with a transformed answer file document, or just it's a file. And then those answers can be brought into your case management system. And so here you actually have options. Some programs choose to keep the information separate in a holding area for review within their case management system, meaning that very little bit of that information is actually visible to the intake worker while they do a conflicts check and things like that before they actually fully accept it and integrate the answers into their case management system. But very simple process. Like I said, it's very common or very similar to doing a document assembly project where you create that front-end interview. The only difference is instead of the hot docs portion, you need that middle XSL transform to get the answers into your case management system. So if we move on, the programs that we've worked with in Ohio has been great, in Utah, and all these different programs that we've been working with have kind of come up with this project management structure of what it might look like to do one of these projects with A2J Author. So this is just kind of an overview if you're thinking about doing online intake with A2J Author of the process that your program might take. And so we start off with the planning and preparation phase. Now this would be where you have everything from your basic meetings with all of your project stakeholders to talk about what you want to include and not include in budgets and who's going to be involved, just kind of get everything out on the table. You start with the planning and preparation. The elaboration phase was where you start to actually get into the drafting of your online intake. What do you want to include in your online intake? Maybe you don't want to address financials, maybe you do. Who, if you're not going to exclude anyone, if you will, reject people within this interview. So all of that kind of information gets nailed down in your elaboration phase. And then we move into construction. This is where you'll create your interview. So you'll draft all those individual questions that you saw that Craig was speaking about. So you draft all the language itself. You can include all kinds of extra information. You can attach images in here. And you can build up that interview as much as you want. And then you would go through interview testing and review. This is a great place to have reviews with your stakeholders. Sometimes people don't really understand what you're talking about with online intake until they see it on the screen as an actual user would use it. So there's probably going to be multiple rounds of testing and review, and different teams of people that you want to have reviewed, maybe together or at different points in that process. So at this point, your interview is done, it's ready to be used, you like what it says and how it works. Now all you need is to create that transform, the XSL transform that will take the answers collected by your A2J online intake interview and transform them into a file that your case management system can read. So then once that goes well and you're testing and you make sure that everything goes through the transform and ends up in your case management system, is basically you're done. You train your staff on how that whole process works. So what the answer files look like when they're coming into the system, how to review them, any processes that you need to take within your case management system, and then basically you're up and running. So some questions you might have. This process can seem pretty intense. So in the next slide here, we have some questions that you might have. So two of the main concerns that people usually come up with are, how much time does this take? And how much is this going to cost? So if we move to the next slide, you'll see that unfortunately, I cannot give you an answer on either of those. It absolutely varies from program to program. You know, some programs have a technical staff, and some programs, you know, can barely keep their legal staff. So it really depends on your staffing resources. I know some programs actually use attorneys to create their document assembly forms and their online intake, whereas I mentioned, you know, some other programs might be larger statewide programs that have technical resources. So it absolutely depends on your staffing resources available. If you're going to complete the project in-house, then I have a suggestion here is that, you know, you estimate high, especially for times when other projects might come up for those resources that are pulling double duty and doing more than one project, you know, carrying the regular duties plus taking on the development of this online intake project. And again, the same answer as what I'm going to have for cost. It absolutely varies from program to program. It depends on your staffing. It depends if you're going to outsource it or keep it in-house. You know, if you want to go a longer time to spread out the cost and people work on it as they can, you might pull in extra resources and, you know, to get a shorter amount of time, but that might up your cost. So it absolutely depends, and I really can't give you an exact answer on that. But I do have a couple of suggestions for both time and cost, is that we strongly suggest that you don't start from scratch. There are programs out there that have been doing this for the past couple of years. They've developed really great online intake interviews. Now, it might not be exactly what you want, but it's a great starting place. You know, there's financial questions built into there that collect assets and expenditures and personal information. So you can actually start with somebody else's interview, pick and choose which pieces that you like, some that you might just want to alter, you could rearrange it, but definitely don't reinvent the wheel. That will save you both time and cost. And then we've also had another group of organizations that I thought was great for both time and cost savings, was that a group of small organizations got together and they had the same case management system. So they created one interview as a group, so they were able to pool just a few resources amongst all the different organizations to create their one main interview that would then have the transform that would go into that case management system. But then each program just took it and tweaked it a little bit. So you would change your program name and contact information if there's any other minor changes that you would need to make. But they were able to pool their resources to get the large part of that project tackled for less time and less costs than they would have if they had done it on their own. So there's a few suggestions there that could help reduce time and costs, but again, I really can't give you an exact, because everyone's resources are different. And I know that and the next slide here, and actually I think it's a couple slides later, but we have some other programs that I know are doing this, and so, you know, speaking with them, if you're going to actually start to use A2J Author, was probably a great way to get a better estimate about time and cost that they spent and see if that is along the lines of what you're anticipating. So that was a very quick overview of using A2J Author for online intake. I have been doing a more in-depth training series for this whole year. We did a 5-part series, each of them about an hour long. And so I've already gone through parts 1 through 3. And we had an intro session, talks about the benefits, the concerns, everything from to get you started with your project. And then we spent an entire hour talking about managing this project, the different phases, who would be involved, what kind of personnel resources that you might need, and how much of their time. And then we talked about just what I mentioned, taking someone else's interview, don't start from scratch, but customizing it, reviewing it, editing it, how to use A2J Author to do that process and get through that easily. So we have 2 sessions left, which are actually extremely important sessions. So if you haven't joined us for the first 3, those are actually recorded and you can watch them, but please join us for the next 2. You don't have to have had the first 3 to step in at this point. So the next session that we're going to have is going to be talking about the technical aspects of online intake. So you have this online intake interview, where are you going to put it? You know, if you want to host your own, that means having your own web server. How does that work? What is this transform that I keep talking about? And, you know, what does that look like and how does that work? So we actually will have John Mayer, who is the executive director of the Cali organization. They are the ones who develop, do the actual coding behind A2J Author. He's going to be on that call and go into way more technical detail than I ever could. So that's actually a great call if you have technical staff to bring them to that call. That would be a great one. And then our last call of the year is going to talk about up and running, more policy things to discuss among your organization, especially for LSC funded organizations. We're going to have an LSC representative come in and talk about their updated policies that they have for programs that are using funding from LSC to do online intake. So that is both those, like I said, both those last two trainings will be great. If you haven't joined us for the first three, please still step in on these last two. And then we have some additional resources that if you want to start to look around on A2JAuthor.org, there's you can download the software and the user guide that is free to any court or legal aid organization that is creating projects to help pro se litigants. So any of the legal aid organizations out there, and that's the case for document assembly and online intake. And you can sign up for monthly trainings. I do an intro training for A2J Author, an advanced training, and then the online specific series. So you can sign up there. You can also find we have an online intake specific page, and that is where all the recordings and all of the slides can be found for the online intake first three parts that we've already done. We also have on there some online intake interviews that great programs have shared and given to us so that we can share with all of you. So you can actually download those A2J interviews, and I believe that Craig shared the Utah one with us, so you can actually see behind the scenes in A2J Author what that looks like. And when you open it, you can see how big of a project it really is. But it's really great to kind of look at those things ahead of time to know what you're getting into. So all of those things are on A2JAuthor.org, and then I believe my last slide here is some of the programs that we know that are using A2J Author for online intake. And some of these ones that are listed at the 10 are the ones that group together to work together. So, and then we also have had with this training series, I know there's a great number of programs that have been joining us throughout the series to get more information because they're planning on using our software for online intake. So just some basic information, like I said, you know, if you want to reach out to one of those organizations or maybe you know someone there to ask them a little more details about how they got through that process. Everyone that I know we've been working with is great, and this whole community has been great about sharing. So I believe that's everything that I have.
Okay, thank you, Dina. We did get a lot of hands raised to see William's FormRouter application, so I'm going to make him the panelist and have him quickly show that through as we're doing that change here. I did want to mention that, you know, a lot of people, A2J Author and Pro Bono Net work really closely on the document assembly infrastructure, which is Law Help Interactive. Some programs assume that Law Help Interactive is ready to go to facilitate and power up online intake. That is not a safe assumption to make. Law Help Interactive is set up to assemble documents like Dina showed in her first slide. If anybody is interested, because maybe you don't have the server capacity or the technical capacity and you're thinking that you want to do an online intake application and use Law Help Interactive, please call me or Allison before you assume that, because we need to figure out if it's something that we can support, and it generally requires a custom tweak on the back end of LHI to make it happen, because like I said, our main function right now is assembling documents and hopefully soon e-filing documents. But taking XML data and doing a transfer and putting them in a custom case management system, that is not something that we have been doing en masse, and we're not funded to do en masse. So just a heads up that if you want to consider that option, give us a call before you start the project so that we can figure out whether it's something that we want to support or not, and how we would go about that. So just heads up on that. So William, we see your screen.
If you point your browser to intake.alsp.org, the first page you should get is what I call the terms and conditions, the T's and C's. So we attempt to clearly explain, you know, don't use this application if you have a short deadline, yada, 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 go through that. Talk about what we can and cannot do. Can't help with traffic tickets, can't help with criminal cases, can't help with juvenile cases. We do tell them that if they enter an email address, we'll send them an email back saying we've received their application. At the bottom of the T's and C's, they can choose to either accept the terms and conditions or reject the terms and conditions. If they accept, click the next button, they get the next page of they get the actual application. Any field that's red is a required field. So you can see a lot of the fields on the form are required. So first name, last name, street address. We do ask them, this is probably version 5 or 6 of this particular form, because we've added some more detail and taken some stuff off. I know one of the things we added after a couple of months of trial and error was asking them what was the best time to call them and what was the best number to call them back at, which was incredibly helpful. Yep. So you can roll through the form. And we attempted to gather, we needed enough information to be able to do the initial screening, but certainly this isn't a full-blown intake. This is a screening tool. So we tried to keep it as short as possible, and it's around 2 pages right now. So you go through the financials. We asked them to describe their problem, asked them for a callback time. And basically, at that point, you hit the submit button in the bottom right-hand corner, and this page goes to FormRouter. Actually, the first page went to FormRouter as well. But this page goes to FormRouter. They take the PDF with the data filled out and email it to our intake list email address, so everybody on the intake team actually gets a copy of the filled out online intake as a PDF, so they know that one's been done and submitted. But the data also gets stripped out of each one of these fields and dropped into the proper tables in the online intake database and sits there until it's acted upon. So that's if I hit submit, what will it tell us? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff I need to fill out in order to hit submit. So let me hit submit. But the third page you would have seen, if I fill it all out and hit submit, would thank you, and I think it says something to the effect that someone will be in contact with you within the next 5 business days or something to that effect. And they'll also get an email generated. They'll get an email saying that we've received the online intake application. And to give everybody a sense of the volume of online intakes that we do, I ran the report for September, for the month of September. Looks like there were 1,248 total hits on the initial application for service page. And of that 1,248, it looks like we did just shy of 400 were actually submitted as completely filled out online intakes. And that's about an average month for the online intake application. Now this is version 1 of our online intake project. You know, this is a PDF form. So it's extremely simple to get this developed. You know, there's obviously no HTML coding. We do host the form, but you can have FormRouter host it if you don't want to host it. But you know, as I said before, some of the issues we have with the PDF form are the fact that some clients may or may not have a good PDF reader installed, so that's a barrier entry. We do have Google Analytics and some real-time analytics running on the website, so we can see where people come in and how long they spend on a page, but we don't know where within the online intake page they may stop and not continue the form and not submit an application. So our hope is with the pure HTML form that obviously, 1, they don't have to have a PDF reader anymore, and 2, we're going to be able to watch the online intake process and get a sense of where people are stopping, and hopefully with some exit interviews can infer why they stopped where they stopped, and maybe make the wording a little clearer or give them some guidance on the front end. We're also going to do the bilingual form. We're going to do it in Spanish, and we've seen a pretty good uptick in the number of people that are attempting to fill out this PDF via smartphones. So there'll be a mobile version of the HTML form once we have it up and running, and we're hoping to have this all done by the end of the year.
And William, there was a question actually for you and Craig about what type of CMS system you're using.
We're using legal files.
Okay.
Our legal files is running on Microsoft SQL. So the online intake database is it's a separate. The online intake database is also running on the same SQL server, but it's a separate database. It's an online intake database that's completely and totally separate from case management database.
Mm-hmm.
And we purge the online intake data every 60 days. There's a stored routine on the online intake database that on the 60th day that online intake data is sitting there, it actually gets dropped. So we don't carry any online intake data past 60 days.
Okay. How about you, Craig? What type of CMS are you using?
We use CAMPS.
Okay. And is your application integrated into the CAMPS intake module?
Yeah, as Dina described, we actually run it on our website, and so they just on our website they can fill out the application, and then the file that's generated goes through the transform and then is deposited on our local server here in Salt Lake, and then it's intake can import that at any time they want to. So it is imported directly into CAMPS. We do have a holding spot. We created a whole new table just for online intake rather than import it directly into our client information, so that intake can deal with it, determine whether or not it really needs to go into the case management system, and then they just push a button and it goes into either as an eligibility slip or as a full case. So we did create a holding cell, so to speak, in between the two.
Yeah, I think that the issue of having a holding database or an intake database that's separate from the main client database, that's a best practice, at least in legal services. So I think different people are arriving at this differently, but by now I think we all understand that at least the conflict check information is kept separately until a determination has been made, because there could be material legal information in the application that you don't necessarily want to come and have access to until you know, are they a client, are they a denied applicant, or are you going to do unbundled services, and what the nature of the relationship will be. We did have another question, William, and I'm going to read it. It was about whether you use the FormRouter to make the form interactive, or do you just use the middleware to convert and send to the case management system?
So the first one was?
Did you use FormRouter to make the form interactive?
Well, not really. The FormRouter, as the name of the company suggests, they simply route the. We built the PDF form ourselves using Adobe Acrobat. So building the form is easy. You just do it in Acrobat. But what FormRouter does is they put some of their code. There's some hidden code in the PDF that says basically someone's requested this page, which is the terms and conditions, and when they hit submit, that filled out page goes to FormRouter, and they say, oh, we've received a yes on the terms and conditions. What should I do next? Well, when they pick yes, we send them this next step of the process, which is the online intake form itself. If they said no, FormRouter says, hey, they said no, therefore we're going to send them the page that says, well, we're sorry you said no. Here are some additional resources you may want to contact to help solve your problem. So FormRouter is the logic at each step of the process. Hey, you've hit the terms and conditions page. Well, the answer is yes or no, and I'm going to send you the next page based on the reply we get from the applicant. So FormRouter is that piece of middleware, for lack of a better term, that's able to look at the answer that's given on the PDF form, make that decision, send them the next page in the workflow, and more importantly, they take the data off of that form that we've developed ourselves and puts it into our online intake database. So we've, in one step, we've captured the online intake data via the web, but we've also populated the same fields in our online intake database.
And that's a great economy in terms of resources, because it's kind of like when you go to United, you check your own bag, and you don't have to have staff to type that back in.
We're all used to working with PDFs, so that's a piece of software we're comfortable working in. So we're able to manipulate the form at our whim. But more importantly, I mean, because you're familiar with the tools in order to build the form that you want to put on the web. That's simple to do, and you know the cost is extremely economical. We get a nonprofit discount with FormRouter, so I think we're paying them $3,000 annually for the middleware function. So you know, we develop the form, they provide the workflow logic and the software to integrate with the database that we created. So that solves two of the big hurdles that you have, obviously, with online intake. Is one, how do you capture the data? And two, once you capture the data, what do you do with it?
What do you do with it? Yes. Now, there's a question that it's for everyone. I think it's a question about how do you deal with errors when the applicant makes a mistake. For example, the client puts their first name in the last name and the last name in the first name field. I don't know if anybody wants to tackle it.
Well, I can start out just by saying that we require all of the people who submit an application online to talk to an intake worker. So the intake worker reviews the information that was submitted and verifies that it's correct. So if they did that, the intake worker, you know, in theory would be able to figure out that they had done it incorrectly, and then the intake worker can change it.
And in your system too, right, William, you do have contact with everyone.
Well, we call everybody back. You know, there's got to be a human being in the process to catch those kind of errors. So that's the reason why we ask what's a good callback number and a callback time. Because we're going to call every single applicant back to verify that the information they provided is accurate and true. And also, you know, they may be, you know, they very well be asking for a divorce, but there may be other legal issues there that we need to address. There may be a public benefits issue or a DV issue, or there's a lot of issues that you can flush out. And we've got a staff of paralegal and intake folks that's part of what they do, is they do the callbacks on the online intake application.
There was a question here, also a very good question, about how do you avoid the creation of multiple name cards for the same client in legal files. I don't know if you have tackled that. And I can unmute the person that asked the question in case you need more. Michael, I'm going to unmute you. I think that's a very good question. Or like if somebody clicks on the application 2 times, are you doing something to avoid the entry 2 times?
Well, I mean, they can fill out the online intake application as many times as they want.
Okay, so you don't put a message like you already clicked this application.
No.
No. Okay. How about you, Craig? Do you have any systems to avoid duplication of application?
In the sense that they can submit it as many times as they want, no.
Okay.
There's no way to track, you know, if they've already submitted it. But when it goes into that holding cell, we can check for duplicate cases. And so if they fill it out and submit it again, we can check for duplicate. And if there is a duplicate, then obviously we don't put it into the full system, and we just discard it and give them the information that we've already given them if they contact us. So in that sense, as far as getting into the actual case management system, we can avoid duplication.
There were some other questions related to LHI being able to send data through an email system, and generally the answer is yes. I can have a conversation about that with people as they become interested on that. Some programs actually, Kansas Legal Services is assembling a document of LHI and then instructing applicants to email the application via the LHI email function. So that is happening, and one of the things with that is that it totally distorts your state statistics because the application will be counted as an assembly of a legal document. And right now we're trying to figure out how we can provide a report where we can separate the intake legal services application, which is not the same thing as a pleading, etc. But yes, that can be done, and I'm happy to talk with people about that if that's of interest. But generally, most of the people doing online intake are looking to just do the XML or some sort of data collection into a transform, into a staging database, and to eventually determine the level of relationship and then go on. Okay, I see a couple people with hands raised, and I'm going to call on them just briefly. Well, actually, John Meyer has a question. John, I'm going to unmute you.
Hey.
John, you're unmuted.
Hi. It was just a quick question. Is your HTML version for the Alabama intake going to use FormRouter, or are you just going to go HTML directly into legal files?
We'll still use FormRouter.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. The web to database connection is complex enough that it's well worth continuing to use FormRouter.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And they've, I mean, and it's really an economics question. We've already done the data mapping with this form, with the PDF form, so we know what the field name is, and we know what the corresponding table name is, and we know what the corresponding name card is in legal files. So we've already done all that data mapping. So we're gonna keep that logic in place.
Makes sense. Is FormRouter expensive?
If you were to go to them today and say, I want this package, I think they quote it out at about $5,000 a year. And then when you mention you're a nonprofit, they kick it down to $3,000. So we're paying $3,000 a year for the middleware piece.
Yeah, it's not bad. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I hope that this was helpful. It's going to be posted in the LSN-TAP website, and wanted to highlight that there are up and coming trainings coming up. The next one is on November 2nd, which could be Dia de los Muertos. I'm not absolutely sure. It's generally early November if you celebrate that. And it's called All Things Mobile. So if you're interested in that, William, somebody did ask about the comment you made about the smart forms. Can you verify that you did say that most of your applications, or a significant proportion of them, are coming from smartphones?
We've seen, I mean, overall, it's a small percentage of the total. I think as of today, it's the last time I looked a month or two ago, it was probably 3 or 4% of the total online intakes. You could tell from the metrics that they were done on a mobile device. Okay, but that number was 0 a year ago.
Okay.
You know, so this has been up and running for 24 months, and to go from 0 to 4% in less than a year says there's some pretty good there's some pretty good demand that I foresee on the horizon with that kind of growth rate. And if you know, and you don't know what that number would be if you really had a mobile version of the online intake form. I think if you make it convenient for people to use mobile, then I think I anticipate seeing a large explosion of mobile-based online intake once we offer it. Because they're trying to do it now on a form that's not optimized for mobile. I mean, it's cumbersome to do them as a PDF on a mobile device right now. You can do it, but you really got to want to do it.
Okay, so All Things Mobile, it's going to be offered as part of this series on the 2nd, and then the next one is the why and how of social media strategies. So this should be also very exciting, a new way to reach out partners and build relationships and communicate with larger groups of like-minded people. And this is going to be on the 16th of November. So I encourage you all to keep logging in and and sharing this with other people who are working on similar innovations. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.